Hi, so we went through the introductory where we were showing how we use the Open Azure AI to ask questions of our data within SharePoint. And that points specifically at our documentation within SharePoint. And in our example, showed where we are asking questions both through Teams and through a Power App where it pulls the information out from our data in SharePoint. So how exactly did we set that up? Well, it was actually relatively easy. The biggest problem that you've got here is that both of the scenarios, such as using Azure OpenAI as well as using the SharePoint indexer, are both in preview. So unless you make specific requests from Microsoft to enable that functionality on your environment, you're not actually allowed to use this functionality just yet. And the other proviso just around that SharePoint indexer is that it might not actually roll out as a productionized license. It's still waiting to be seen with some of the other AI technology that they're building. That being said, we're going to start off in Azure. So the first thing is making that request to be able to build an Azure OpenAI service. Now, once you've got the request through from Microsoft, they enable it on your tenant, and it's actually relatively easy to build. If we go to all resources, create a new resource, and within here, we type in Azure OpenAI. And through the process, we choose the Azure OpenAI, and we fill in the normal details like you normally would in Azure, putting in a resource, providing a name, providing the region, etc. Now, that all works fine. That is literally the only bit of information you need to fill in here. Putting in the standard SO tier obviously also works well, but that is the setup that's required for Azure OpenAI. The other service that you need is an Azure search service. So here, once again, you would go to Create and Azure Search. And this is actually the Azure Cognitive Search, where you would create a new cognitive service and fill in the basic data. Now, quite importantly, by default, it sets the pricing tier to standard. And if you want to, you can go and change that to free if you want to trial the service, which works great. I mean, you've got the ability to add in 3 indexes and up to 50 megs worth of storage. Now, if we were setting up this Azure search specifically to look at data that's either in an Azure blob storage or a file server, as an example, the chances are you'd actually be going through the standard setup rather than the free setup. However, you are provided with those indexes. But if you were looking at data on file servers and the likes, and you wanted to use it with Open Azure AI, you would need to also set up a forms recognizer service so that you can read the data, and potentially a blob storage service. So a lot of the documentation you'll find online is setting up OpenAI with those services, but not with the SharePoint portion. If you're setting up the SharePoint portion, you don't need any of that. You just need the Azure Cognitive Services and the Azure OpenAI. Once you've got this Azure Search Service set up and you have requested from Microsoft to enable the functionality for the SharePoint indexer, they will then send you a confirmation that you can use it on their tenant, on your tenant. And you would go through the setup, which is not a click and play setup. In order to run the setup, what you need to do is run a number of functions, and the best way to do that is using Postman. So with our services set up, we'll open up Postman, And they've actually got a quick start where it installs the create index, the create data source, and the create indexer functions for you. And that's all in the documentation they send you when you set this up. What you really need to do is generate this function within Postman. And then with the Postman area, you would upload a number of different variables. And those variables would include things like your service name, as well as for authorization, you need to pass through your admin key, which you get from your service account in Azure. So that part of it, you just go to the overview page. It's got the service name. It's got the admin key as well. I think it's API key one. Now, you put that data into the variables and then you utilize it here. So here it's calling the service name, it's providing the specific service. At the same time, within their documentation, it's got all of the fields that you need in your body. So here we just provide an index, which in this case I called it SharePoint FO index for our free service. You create that index, it tells it exactly what to index, which is all of your documentation within the system. And this is the basic data that it's going to bring back. So from my SharePoint data, it will bring back the item's name, the item's path, the content, when it was last modified, what the size is, and the actual content itself. So it does the index, brings that data back for us. Once we've created the index, we then need to create a data source. And that data source, we point specifically to our SharePoint endpoint, which is our local version of SharePoint, and wherever we're looking for the data. So in my case, I'm looking under our GT documents area and bringing back all of the data for that data source, and the connection type is for SharePoint. So once again, we give it a name. So in this case, GT F0 SharePoint data source. We then actually create the indexer, and the indexer just tells it when it should be kicking off this index and how often and all of the rest. And in there, we need to give it a name. We need to tell it what the data source is and what the index is. And once you've set up that indexer, it will go and start running. And you can actually see that indexer. If we go back into our search service over here, and we jump across to indexes. There's the index setup. You can then see the indexes and whether it's run completely, when it was last run, and what the data sources are. So the first time you set this up, it's going to go and run, and it will go through that data. And you can actually use a function to go and look at the SharePoint indexer and see what the status is, and it tells you when it's completed with the data. Once it has finished indexing, you are ready to actually use this Azure Search Service. And one of the items that you can use is the search documents, where you will pass it through the URL, but then in terms of search, you would give it a term. So in this case, we put in a WildStar, being X for absolutely anything. So it's going to look for all of our documentation against SharePoint. We'd run that, and it gives us our responses. So that's just to make sure that you're getting your documents back, and that's all done in Postman. But now we took that, we got the results from our Azure Search Service, and we pushed it into OpenAI so that we could generate information from that SharePoint data. And we did that using Power Automate. So let me jump over to that and show you what the setup is there. Okay, so we've got our call Azure Search Service. We're kicking this off manually with the search term. So you provide your search term, and then it'll go through and find that documentation. I've created a number of variables here. The first is a object, and that object contains my service name, my admin key. Now, Why I've done that is so that if you're pushing this into production and you want to go and change the variables, you can go and change them in one place. And I've done that both for Azure Cognitive Search as well as for OpenAI. The next is the OpenAI query. And the OpenAI query is just a blank array. This is where we start building the data that we're passing through to OpenAI, and you pass it through as an array of data to get insights back from OpenAI. We've also got a variable set up for a result count, and the reason for this is I am running the Azure OpenAI model, which is 3.5 GPT, which has a limitation on the amount of data that you can actually send to it. So when I get information back from Azure Cognitive Search, I limit it to the number of results that I want and make sure that the data isn't too large passing through to OpenAI. Once I move that on to the GPT-4, then I can play with a whole lot more data. Just waiting for that license to come through from Microsoft as well, because that's also another request. Whilst you get the OpenAI, it has DaVinci, it has GPT 3.5, doesn't have the GPT-4 included in it at this point in time. Okay, so now we're going to get into our query. And within the query, we're going to use a get query that we are passing through to our Azure service. So from my variables in the object up above, I'm getting the URL, I'm getting the search index name, I'm passing through the search term that I passed up above, and then I'm passing through that it is application JSON as the content type, and my app key, which I've gotten from Azure, and I'm pulling that from my object up above as well. So 3 items in this Azure search that we've set up here. Once we get the values back, it comes back with all of that data, including the items ID, the path, the URL, the content, etc. And I'm parsing that data just to make it easy for me to have a look at and manipulate. So it comes back with a specific structure. You can see there, very similar structure. We've got a score, which tells it how relevant that result is. We've got the ID, we've got the item, the path, the content. And the first time you run this, you'll get this data. You can put it in as a sample, and it will automatically generate this value for you. If you've not used parse JSON before, it basically gets the result, and it just puts it into a nice structure for you that you can use. Now, I'm using that data to generate a better looking object. So when we get our results back, it generates a result where it has these values that's an array. And I want to select that value and put it into a nicer array where it's actually got the data in a structure that I want, saying search term, name, path, type, modified content. I don't want to deal with values that have metadata, SPO, item path. It doesn't work nicely with me. So the select array is a nice way to, or select function in Compose, in Power Automate, is a nice way to actually just build out the results that you get into a cleaner array. I'm then running a do until function, and I want to do this for 5 of the top results that I get from my documents. And this, as I explained, is just because of the sheer load that you can pass through to OpenAI. I wanted to restrict that information. So I'm setting when the result count is equal to 5 to stop this do until. I then compose a value, and that value is what I'm going to be passing through to OpenAI. Now, when you have a look at the OpenAI API documentation, you'll see that you can start a conversation and then you can pass additional information into OpenAI so it can continue the chat and be contextually aware of what it's passing back to you and what you're passing to it. So it keeps a full track of your information. Now, it looks at that data, it looks at what it's provided you, as well as any assistant type of documentation. So in this case, we're going to grab all of the content that is delivered to us, and we are going to create assistant roles with the content that has been passed through to us. So for every one of these items that comes in here, we're going to add the content as a role assistant. So that's an object with role, assistant, content, whatever the content is that's been passed through over here. So here we can see body, variable, result count, and that's what we're really looking for. Now, we created that AI array up above here, and we are pushing the object over here into that array, and then we're incrementing the result count. So first one comes through, it gets the body of the first document, puts it in there, adds it to the array, ups the count. So it's now 2, second one, third one, fourth one, fifth one. And after the fifth one, it jumps out of this do until loop. At that point, it will go and do whatever else it needs to do. So for our example here, this is going to be going to Azure OpenAI and passing the values through. Okay, so after that do until loop, we are going to build an additional call to OpenAI that we're going to add to that array. And you'll notice here, in terms of our object, it's no longer an assistant, but actually the user. And the content we're going to pass through our search term. That's also getting pushed into that OpenAI array as an additional item in our question. So our question is made up of all the assistants, which is the documents, as well as the question that the user has posed. And that then builds our entire object that we're going to be sending in to OpenAI. Okay, so in terms of the OpenAI function, here we post. Once again, I've done the same at the top with the variables for OpenAI, where I've got the URL, the name of the deployment, and then we're calling the chat completions API and version 2023-0315 preview. Now, the completions API is the one that can take in all of these different pieces of data and complete whatever you're trying to ask it. So it gets passed through, once again, an API key that comes from our object up above, as well as the content typing application JSON in terms of the headers. And then the body for this post is made up of a single object with messages and the array that we've built up above. So that's the full array of all the assistants and the user's question. That gets kicked into OpenAI, and that returns us a result. So let's have a look at this running. Okay, so here's our run results. So in terms of the manual trigger, I've passed through the question, what is Gildenes and Top Pty Ltd's address? Now, that is our holding company. This has gone and generated our content and called the Azure Search Services, passing through that question as our search term. And it's generated a number of results. So if we go and have a look at those results, we can see all of the data that has been brought back in terms of documents and questions and all the rest, but it's an absolute nightmare to read. So that is why we parse the data in JSON and then generate an array with any of the data, including the document's name, where it lives, what the application type is, including the content of the document. It then runs through a do until loop to figure out what items it wants to pass through into our OpenAI array. And it does that by passing through the role being assistant and the content type being all of the information that it gathered from our array above. Finally, it adds our question, which is, what is Gildeneys & Tar Pty Ltd's address? It groups all of that data together and sends that off to the Azure OpenAI completion chat, which when we open up and have a look at the results here, says according to the provided document, Gildeneys & Tar's address is Unit B3, Merrington Park, 2 Merrington Place, Hillcrest. So it's gone through all of the data, looked at it, analyzed it, and returned the result through the completion chat API. And that's as simple as it is to start setting up this functionality. When you want to push it into Teams, all you need to do is look for a term within Teams and respond to that term accordingly by calling these APIs. Hope that helps you. For more, have a look at the GTconsult channel. Thanks.